infants and toddlers that are nonverbal, they seek praise and approval. Separation is really difficult for them. They may have just some verbal skill, very minimal. They use gestures to communicate oftentimes, and they're starting to begin to imitate others' language. 3 to 5-year-olds, world revolves around them. They're very egocentrical. They might be bossy, testy, show off. They're beginning to know the difference between right and wrong. They have short attention spans. They might not be able to identify colors. A lot of times I'll pull out markers and I'll have them tell me what the colors are and just kind of get an idea of where they're at. And sometimes I'll have them, I'll tell them, you keep 2, give me 3, just to kind of see as far as how high they can count. We're talking about how many times something happened. And they can correctly identify known people in their lives, so there should be no confusion of identity. They respond well to praise and encouragement. They're protective of their parents usually. They might feel guilty at this point. And they believe in general that adults speak the truth. So that can go in our favor and also against our favor because they're going to, the perpetrator, we don't know what they've told the child. These kids in that age group use and interpret language literally, so we have to be very black and white when we're talking to them. Proper pronunciation isn't yet developed. They don't understand before and after, so you have to be really careful with that if you're trying to say, did this happen before he put his finger inside of you or after? Remember, they're not going to know. They're not going to be able to answer that, so you have to word your questions differently. They use words for time, distance, size, kinship, etc. Long before they understand their meaning. So a lot of times just make sure when they're that age and when they're that young, they're using words and it doesn't sound like they're answering you appropriately. Make sure you revisit that and ask a different question. They have difficulty with pronouns. Again, as I mentioned, he, she use names rather than pronouns. They can't usually respond to how many times, and a lot of times I try not to ask that question when they're that young because sometimes they'll give you a number because they're just going to answer, and they don't necessarily know. So that's not really good for your interview if you can avoid asking how many times. And if you do ask those kinds of questions, say did it happen 1 time, 2 times, or more than 2 times. That way you have multiple choice and they're not just giving you an answer. They also have difficulty with negatives, such as didn't you see the car? So try not to ask your questions in that way. So again, they do best with simple sentences that have 1 subject, 1 verb, 1 object. Child's meaning of words can be very different from adults. Touch, close, remember. Children may not coordinate, or they might only coordinate touch with a hand. So when you're talking to them and say, did he touch you? Well, they may say no, but maybe oral copulation isn't considered in that. Kids don't realize that that's touching. Or if he's masturbated them with another object other than his hand. So you have to be real careful of how you ask your questions, be very specific. And oftentimes they don't realize that, think about clothing, they don't realize that underwear is clothing, so they may not mention that in their statements. They're trying to find out stuff about who removed their clothing. And they tend to focus on only one aspect of a situation or question at a time. So if your questions are complicated and contain a number of ideas, it's going to be fruitless for you. And also kids want to give an answer to every question, even if they don't have any knowledge or reason. In the English language, questions and answers form an invisible pair. So answers don't happen without a question first. If a question is left unanswered, then something's perceived to be wrong. And children learn that very quickly, so keep that in mind. And children don't recognize events in their minds the way that we do as adults. When they're telling of past events, they might leave out settings, descriptions and details, chronology. As I said, they're not very good at that, and motivation. They don't really understand. And they're not mature enough to organize the details of the narrative. Usually, they don't know that they don't know something. So asking them if they understand a lot of times is a waste of time. You have to just ask a question that makes, where they ensure that they know what you mean. So developmental stages, between 6 and 10 years old, they're less self-centered at this time. Family's still very important to them. They have strong likes and dislikes. They have the ability to form their own ideas and opinions. They begin to understand abstract concepts such as time and symbolism. They can place themselves in time using special events, kind of like we talked about, and activities as markers. They begin to understand cause and effect at this age also. They understand some implications of revealing information. They might still believe that adults in general speak the truth. Their language is more socialized between these ages. They still might have difficulty in handling abstract concepts, so be careful when you're questioning there too. They still have problems processing complex questions, so try to keep it very black and white when questioning. They're easily confused by complex multiple negatives, such as you don't deny you did it, do you, for example, so again, keep it simple. They're still not mature at organizing the details of narratives. And they can be unequipped to deal with adult insincerities such as sarcasm, irony, and so on. So try to leave that out of it when you're questioning the kids. So developmental stages for 11 to 18-year-olds. Obviously, this age is going to be a little bit easier to talk to. They're going through puberty though, so it might affect their demeanor and their behavior. They're developing their own sexuality at this point. They might be moody. Peer relations are very important to them at this time, these ages, and they're becoming independent, but they're still dependent. Oftentimes they start to change, and they're not as trusting of adults. And oftentimes we can communicate with them as an adult. They still don't necessarily have good narrative skills, and you still want to be careful with your questions. Make sure they're still simple and asked at a child's level for their age. They might be able to give more specific dates and information. They should be able to provide the details of when, how, where, and the duration. They may not understand time as both historical, what goes on and on without them, and the day-to-day concept that affects their lives. They still have difficulty with multiple negatives, and this problem can continue into adulthood for a lot of people. They're still confused by complex questions, so still continue to keep your questions as simple as possible. They can still be confused by linguistic ambiguity, such as metaphors, idioms, proverbs, jokes. Try to just keep everything again and again. I keep saying black and white. A lot of teens, especially if they're having emotional and social problems, are still stuck in the school age between 6 and 10. So keep that in mind when you're talking to them, to talk to them at that level. Factors affecting your child's response to your questions. The relationship between the victim and offender is really important. In incest cases, usually they involve a very seductive relationship. And it progresses over time, where the offender tries to lower the child's inhibitions and disregarding any physical contact with them. Even if the offender is not a household member, it's likely they've spent a lot of time with the child and they've given her gifts or whatever type of thing that they can do to make the child want to be with them. They do oftentimes you can give, so don't forget to ask those kinds of questions if they've ever been given anything or anything like that. Offenders can manipulate adolescents, oftentimes buying their silence. Regarding sexual interaction, they might make them feel shame or guilt that it's their fault, embarrassed, that they'll use these things so that the children have a more difficult time making any disclosure or even any report. And you just have to remember that the child might love the perpetrator again, as I said before. They don't really want to have them out of their life, they just want the abuse to stop. Other factors, you need information concerning the nature of the relationship between the victim and the suspect, and that'll help you phrase your question appropriately, and you can kind of anticipate their responses to questions about the offender. So you want to get this information from family members or whoever's in the life of the child that might know those relationships. As I said, children love the offender oftentimes. They don't want him to go to jail. They don't want them to leave the house even, just have the abuse stop. And again, all that information can be obtained from people in the child's life. The relationship between the non-offending parent and the offender, you want to know that also. You want to know if there's support there. It's going to make it easier for the child if they have a supportive non-offending parent or somebody in their life that's a family member close to them, someone supporting them. Generally, the longer the abuse has gone on, the more difficult it is to disclose the abuse and to describe incidents, because a lot of times they just, in their memories, it's all together. Secrecy, coercion, threats of violence, this increases obviously a child's feelings of helplessness and his fears about disclosing. So we're going to try to address those things to try to help the child overcome that. The age at the time the abuse started, as opposed to the age at the time of disclosure, affects the child's willingness to talk too. So if it's been going on a long time, you can have a more difficult time getting the disclosures out of them. In many cases, if it's a delayed report, there's conflicting or unconvincing disclosure, oftentimes they'll retract their statements. Again, it's real important for the parents that, you don't know what the child feels, even if the non-offending parent is supporting them, they might feel that they don't believe them. So it's important to know that they're thinking about that. And people tend to minimize their involvement in guilt-ridden, stressful, or embarrassing situations. Child's statements might be influenced by the way others respond to their initial disclosure. That's important too. You want to know what happened when you told mom or whoever you told initially, school counselor. The child's perception of your reactions also affect how they respond during your interviews. And of course, I know you all know this, but don't act appalled when a child begins to describe horrible acts. Just try to keep your straight face. So cooperation is really important. And a child's credibility as a witness will be challenged primarily in this area. Can I have the defense just leave? No, I'm just kidding.
Okay, I'll go right now.
So the defense attorney is going to challenge in this area, and in many child molest cases, there's little physical evidence, as I already mentioned, to support the child's allegations. And defense attorneys are going to argue that the child's confused or mixing fact with fantasy. You're usually going to only have the child's disclosure, and so it's important to talk to other people and try to get corroborating information. So we need to understand that there may be times that a child might lie when an authoritative adult instructs them to do so. You want to know the situation in the child's life. Is there a custody battle going on? Because the child might be told to allege abuse so that the other parent can get full custody. Grandparents and older siblings might coach the children to lie. Teenagers occasionally make false allegations about step-parents out of revenge. Family pressure or lack of support system in some cases may cause incest victims to lie or recant after disclosure. So just keep all these things in mind when you're talking to kids, and when we go over the phases of the interview, you should have a good idea of doing your background and asking the questions properly. You'll have an idea whether or not they've been coached. So most authorities agree, and I already said this, but that normally children do not lie about sexual abuse incidents. Small children, as I said, are not capable of making up complicated lies that describe activities that they have not actually experienced. So that goes in our favor because a lot of experts already agree to that on both sides. We want to, we're looking for consistency with what the child has told others. Pieces of corroborating evidence, or you want to make sure they're in line with the details of the child's story. So when you're talking to these different people, try to get that consistency and see if there's anything that's there. And just don't forget that when you're doing these cases and you're talking to the various people, that kids might give one piece of information to one person and a different piece of information, especially when there's multiple events, to another person. So you're not going to get just the same consistent story exactly with each person you talk to and what they tell you. And a lot of times, maybe they're more comfortable with the reporting person that they tell, parent or whoever, and they'll give more detail than us, or vice versa. So a thorough investigation includes interviewing the witnesses, other family members, siblings, anybody who has contact with the child. And just keep in mind that suspects might coach or coerce the child or threaten the child or these people. Sorry, not the child, but them too. But they might threaten these people. So if you can, and it's not always possible because they usually know once a report has been made, but if they don't, I would try to get to these family members before you talk to the suspect and get their information as soon as you can. And don't forget other siblings that might be victims as well. So if you talk to those kids, you're talking to them as possible victims and not just witness statements. And then key people that you might want to interview would be anybody that the child's disclosed to. Get the statements from those people as to what they told them. The reporting person, siblings, people who live with the child or have lived with the child. Don't forget teachers, daycare providers. A lot of times they can give information like on the child's school, for instance, if they were a really good student at one point, and then at some point that changed and they started not taking care of themselves or their grades were failing. Those kinds of things can be good information to have. I just put a little case study on here, just kind of goes over and consistent with a lot of what these investigations involve. I had a child, she was 8, Grandpa was 77. She lived in another state, and she never met her grandpa. They were very poor, they were living in their car and on the streets, and the father, she needed dental work. So the father of the child brought her to Nevada, actually to Urington, where I live in our county, and moved her in with Grandpa so that he could take care of some of these problems. So they put her in school, took temporary custody. So the child obviously is pretty isolated here. She feels like, there's her family's out there. She has no connection with them. She never met her grandpa before, so he's a stranger. And he proceeded to, well, he had her sleeping in the bed with her. And he used procurement. She liked trains, so he took her up to Carson, and he'd take her on the train, and he'd buy her trains and gifts, and just lavished her with a lot of that stuff and love. And you know, she didn't want to lose those gifts or a stable home, and so you can imagine the difficulty for her. She did not want to disclose. And what happened in her case is that she told her friend that her grandpa had sex with her, and then her friend told her mother, who was a substitute teacher. And this is also, I put breakdown and recording in this one because the teacher, who was the mother, didn't want to be involved. So she tells another teacher who says, you have to report this. She reports to the principal, says you have to, so she calls CPS, but wants to remain anonymous. I later, of course, found out who she was and everything, but you know, this is how these cases oftentimes go. And when I got to the little girl, she didn't want to talk to me. And she did eventually give me some disclosure. And then I also ended up, he gave me some confession, and I did a computerized voice stress on him, and then he gave me some more confession, and he was prosecuted. So, but it doesn't always happen like that, but that's just standard a lot of times in these cases. They're never cut and dry. That one either. So I'm going to show you guys, it's a testimony, a victim testimony from Joyce Meyer. Does anybody know who Joyce Meyer is? Well, nobody knows her. She's an evangelist, and this is done professionally. It's 1 hour, but it's so interesting to me because part of it she's talking one-on-one with her producer or whoever she is, and then part of it's at a conference, giving her disclosure. It was never recorded. And, you know, I just kind of like to show you that there's hope that these victims can someday overcome what's happened to them. Because it's disturbing. Their lives, you know, they oftentimes have not very good families that they're growing up in, and, you know, some can overcome that. And I just made some words about what I thought on this video. She speaks in lay person's terms, but as a victim, no different than the victims in the cases we investigate. She's from Missouri, so it's like it doesn't matter where or how long ago, because she's now, I think she's in her 70s. And it's very interesting that so many of these things are the same now as they were then. And just keep in mind some of the things she mentions that might not be direct criminal abuse, but they apply to our cases too, but add to your case because it's procurement or cooperation. Like for instance, I mean this is definitely criminal, but he made her watch him having sex through a keyhole. He made her beg to stay home with the mother or with him while the mother went to the store. So in these cases, you remember too that oftentimes the non-offending parents, they don't know necessarily what's going on because it's a very secret crime. And they might think, well, no, she loves him. She always wanted to stay home with him. So just keep those things in the back of your mind and get that information so you can corroborate what the child says. And when you get witness statements, of course, that's important. There's mentioned that she had another child, that was molested also by her father. Her father's the perpetrator. But they never talked about it, and the crimes were never reported. So that's many of our cases. Joyce felt guilt, embarrassment, shame, all the things we learn about in victim abuse. And her perpetrator turned the guilt on her. You'll hear it when she's talking about it, but he tells her, if she tells, nobody will understand. Nobody will believe her. And telling would cause problems in their family. And we hear these same things today. And it's important to know what they made threats with or what they told the victim. It would add to your case. Family history of abuse is very common in many of our cases. I often had cases where the mother of the victim, I don't know about you guys, but the mother was abused at some point when she was a child, and now her kids are being abused by whoever, a boyfriend or someone else. I had a case one time where the mother, she was abused by her dad when she was a child, and then when she had kids, she allowed the kids to go to grandpa's and then he began abusing them. I don't understand that line of thinking, but it's common that the women just attract abusers or something. I don't know what really it is, but in many cases I had. Mother had been abused, now our kids are being abused. And not every kid's doing. And don't forget when you're talking to the victims, just because it kind of comes up here, is ask if they've ever been abused by anyone else. Because that becomes important in court too, because sometimes the defense will say, well, they're confusing something that happened with somebody else. You want to know everything in this child's history so that you can address that before you go to court. She describes lack of support from her mother. And that, again, that makes it really hard, and probably that's why this was never reported. She didn't have any, her mother didn't know what to do. And she knew about it, though, her mom. And these are just some of the issues and hurdles that we have to deal with and try to overcome. And so if you look at, I wrote a note in there too, that they didn't want to face the scandal. A lot of times there's an embarrassment or a stigma, and grandparents or other family members, they don't want that out there. So there's not support for them to report.